All right. Well, welcome everyone. And after a few little hiccups to start with, only 30 minutes of them, I'm really pleased to say I've got three very fine young fellows. Who we got there? Jeremy Kaufman, of course, who's to my, he's just putting his fingers up. Harry Greene, or Harrison Greene, who looks very good when he's using an auger. And Ethan on the end there. How are you, mate?
Good to
He's
see
looking nice and quiet, and he's the background guy, so taking that position. So they're actually in quite the order. So body language is working for us. And they're, of course, from Propagate Ventures. And Propagate Ventures are an amazing startup, I suppose you'd still say, who are doing amazing work with agroforestry and agroforestry investment projects. So welcome to Regrarians Talk this morning. Tell us a bit about what's going on, gentlemen, with your, yes, please, Brand. You're in California at the moment. What's going on there?
We're here for a conference called Regen 18. It's here in San Francisco. It's a little bit warmer here than it was in New York. You want to jam on Regen 18? What's going on this week?
It seems to be all the tribes of folks who care about generation and concerned with the climate, of how to make things happen and get capital flow into the space.
Okay, so it's actually a capital flow space as much as anything else.
Yeah, I think it's trying to elevate the voices of people who have projects in the ground, as well as trying to communicate that and educate people who are looking to invest. It's a combination.
Okay, well, that's great. And
he's going to be on a panel tomorrow. Is that right?
No, it's in a few days.
In a few days, with some amazing folks, right, from Main Street Project, Reginaldo, and some other awesome folks.
Dr. Bronner's, and then Ejido Verde. They do pine resin plantations in Mexico. Thrive Natural Care, which is not necessarily agroforestry based, but just kind of polyculture skincare products. They're taking off with Amazon pretty well. And it's going to be pretty good.
So do you think that this is a sign that the regenerative moniker has become the new sustainable, and it's being, let's just say, utilized by the corporates in a way that might diminish its value as a brand?
Would you say your question is there some regentrification going on?
Oh, well, yes, and I can see you've been waiting all day to give me that one, Harry. So let's give it to me, mate.
Yeah,
I think people are trying to co-opt the term a little bit, just like sustainable was a couple years back. But I think the integrity of the word is kind of in a different class than sustainable.
Mm-hmm. For how long do you think?
So I think it's going to be hard for. I don't know. It's a good question. It's a really good question. I think it's going to be hard. I think back to like the environmental kind of movements that tried to keep large corporates accountable, and they still kind of won out with words like sustainable. So I don't necessarily know if that's going to be something that a purist like myself hopes to maintain, but yeah.
And there are a lot of people using it well, and there are a lot of people using it poorly. And I think that, or just personally, or as Propagate, we like to just use the words in accordance with what they actually mean. So if something is sustainable, just say that it's sustainable. It's perfectly okay to be sustainable. That is better than being unsustainable. And if something is inherently regenerative, then it's okay to use the word. It's I think the journey is more important than kind of figuring out a standard and saying, all right, we're all there or we're not there.
Yeah, I think that's the real challenge with it, is trying to maintain a continuous improvement model rather than trying to just say like you are or you're not with a check mark.
Yeah.
there seems to be a lot of promise in what can happen on the ground with regenerative agriculture in particular. So I think it's a nice solution set that's being provided to some of the bigger players around that may actually have the opportunity to embody a little bit further what they mean when they talk about sustainable or regenerative, whatever it may be. We're definitely seeing a lot of that happen here. I'm sure it's going on in Oz as well.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that it's got anywhere near the same level of penetration into the corporates that it has here. We have a very different market in that our supermarket concentration of market ownership is much greater than any other country on the planet. So we have two chains that control about 80% of the food supply. So whereas Walmart or some of your bigger chains are only at 20 or 30% by comparison of their market share. So it's quite a different dynamic. And I don't think that we've seen the capital flows go into the use of this, where we don't have any conferences like you're at today, for example. It's just it's fundamentally an outcome of the numbers that are involved in the market. And Australia is a market of 24 million people in total. That's our population, which is about half of California. So yeah, so it's a very different dynamic here.
The U.S. likes to we like to market things before they happen.
Yeah.
Oftentimes, to prove it out, and that's I think what we're seeing right now with the moniker. It's the beginning stages of that market validation for the concept.
So let's keep going.
Just quickly, because on the webinar with Daniela from Savory, there was the question: if this actually takes off, and if the majority latches onto regenerative, is there enough supply of legitimately regenerative food to satisfy that demand, or will the status quo of what is just a bit better be classified as regenerative, and then it gets diluted? So,
yeah, well, I think everyone's playing a bit of catch up, and it's one of the results of innovation. The regeneration space is, I'd have to say, from what I've witnessed, perhaps a lot more innovative than the other iterations that have preceded it, whether it's organic agriculture or whether it's sustainable agriculture or otherwise. That we've got a highly innovative space, because its rise is also timed with the rise of social media, and so it's come at the time of the share economy. And so people are able to share their innovations very, very quickly, and the whole pathway accelerates as a result. So so I think that the regulation of it is catching up. We see that Rodale Institute, for example, have just developed their standards and others. So in organics, it took a long time for standards to come along. I don't think it's taken as long for standards to come along in this space, but they still take time nonetheless. And whether there'll be a co-opting by your government of regenerative as a word, like it did with organic, is another matter as well. So yeah, it's a dynamic space.
Yeah, last year there was a CIG Innovation Award granted to the Delta Institute out in, I believe, Michigan, and to specifically research pathways for financing regenerative agriculture here in the U.S. And that's out of the U.S. That's out of the USDA's CIG Innovation.
That's great.
Conservation Innovation Grant.
Yeah, that's great. So, tell me about Propagate, or tell us all about Propagate. What's its whole base, and give us the elevator pitch, and then we'll dive in a bit deeper and talk about what your big plans are for complete world regeneration.
We always have a question of who's gonna jump in first. So I think today we'll give it to Mr. Greene.
All right. So what we do is manage agroforestry assets from the design through the installation, through to the finance and management of tree crops on land that we don't necessarily own. So that's part of it. Another part of it is linking investment capital with agroforestry systems. So creating the asset class that is tree crops, organic tree crops, more than anything. And much in the way that the solar industry separates their ownership of panels from the land itself, we see a huge opportunity in accelerating the adoption of adding tree crops to farmland without actually purchasing the farmland and tying up capital in the land itself. So yeah, that's one way to look at it.
Okay.
And then there's a lot of kind of ways in which we try to accomplish this. And with varying levels of certainty and kind of, we're about a year and a half into the business, seeing kind of the like going from kind of a state of research and development through to trying to find what the solutions might be. We think that from what we found is that the integration of trees thoughtfully into existing operations on farms is really a key leverage point for agroforestry. Not necessarily us being the landowner, but working with farmers who are really ahead of the curve and are ready to adopt the integration of trees into their operation.
And spinning back to what we were talking about a little bit earlier, how does it all come together and who plays? The key groups of stakeholders that we spend our time with are going to be farms and farmers with brands, kind of going to our corporates discussion a second ago, and then investors. So really what we're focused on is how do we find ways that make it financially viable to put trees in the agricultural landscape across all those stakeholder groups, just creating that win-win-win situation. Plus we get to put some trees in the ground, which makes it fun.
So for those listeners that we have or viewers today we have in Australia, we're very aware that we had what's called managed investment schemes for a long time here, and still to an extent do. We had phases of them in the 1970s, 80s, 90s and noughties. And the most recent ones were growing species like large plantations using managed investment funds of things like olives and almonds and blue gums, Eucalyptus globulus, and a few other species in large plantations on agricultural land with very little integration. In fact, pretty well no integration. That's something that's quite different with you because you're doing agroforestry, so you're all about integrating. Could you just speak to, because if I could just preface my question, one of the biggest problems with all of the MIS schemes that we had in Australia was management fees and just this front ending of the whole program, which ultimately resulted in, I'm trying to think of one MIS that actually succeeded. Can you maybe speak to a bit about your model and how you're not going to go down you're not going down the same pathway? Where's the robustness in yours? Because when you take investor funds and then you take management fees, it's pretty well always been the case that people have front-ended this pretty heavily. And I think that's built a greed into it, which I know already that you guys are not looking to do. So can you speak to that a bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think at the most basic level of how we're trying to solve that problem is by trying to provide the ability for liquidity and asset ownership to flow to the land or farm manager. And kind of through kind of the cash flows of the systems, provide what's called here in the U.S. There's a term which is I'm trying to remember it. It's a certain type of equity that allows for the ownership to be bought out over time relative to the cash flows of the system, such that for us, we're actually looking to hand over a large percent of that equity to the farm managers over time. And in the process, provide the return capital from those cash flows to the investor who are being bought out over the course of 10, 15, 20 years. And that's one of the key ways in which we're trying to solve that problem and trying to bring the capital flow back to the landowner or manager rather than just have it all sit on the investor side.
Yes.
Agreed.
Self-liquidating
Equity.
Okay, right. Well, that's a really interesting model. And what's that model being used in? Is it being used in other sectors of the economy?
Yeah, it's been used in majority of developing countries that in co-op models where investors come in. There's a good example out of Mexico that there's a co-op that is purchasing those kind of self-liquidating equity shares over the course of 10 years, buying out the investors. And there's we're not necessarily doing exactly the same structures as them, because we think that in the U.S. there's a uniqueness to every land base, and every landowner wants a different thing. So because ours is context-based to specific landowners and regions, the cooperative model only fits in certain areas
Gotcha.
on the ground level. So sometimes it's cooperatives, sometimes it looks like a business entity buying out those shares over time. But it really is dependent on the context.
So, in a sense, then that provides some difficulties to you, because being context-based means that you have to, build the context of every relationship that you're more or less facilitating, because that's ultimately what you're doing here. You're an agroforestry investment facilitator.
And scale doesn't, I mean, there are two ways to look at scale. One is via properties and via acreage, and the other way is scaling to whom these systems fit best with. So the human element is really the center of how we're growing this.
And on that same note, the scale is looking at a regionally developed plan, right? Rather than looking at it across kind of a let's just focus on blueberries and try to do that in every region we go into, right? So it's regionally contextual to the people that are there as well.
And so with that's regionally invested as well?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So you're not taking investment funds from someone or say I am an investor, I'm in California and you've got a project in Nebraska. You wouldn't necessarily promote that hookup.
It depends. We would try to source as much of the capital locally as we possibly can, but in a lot of regions that we're looking at, there isn't enough capital there to support project development. So it's a mixed strategy of being able to do both. It's for us. There's a cost benefit to stabilize and across a portfolio of projects by being able to kind of bring them into a pool and then being able to allocate across the risk of each one of those hubs that we're looking at.
Yes, because you're not actually looking to build a fund per se. So you're not fund managers. Every project is its own fund.
And yes, and we're also looking at pooling those to a larger.
So pooling them regionally, so you'd have regional hub funds, as it were.
Yeah, we're finding a lot of parallels along like diversity lines. So in the natural world, we're looking at diversification of the systems through agroforestry on farm. We're finding a lot of parallels to then how do we view investments and what's the diversification of that, the projects that we're working in, where the capital is coming from. So kind of that strength and diversity mentality has a lot of applicability across many of the different things that our business touches.
That's really interesting. So when you're at places like this and you're talking to people, I mean, this is a very, very innovative approach. What's the reaction that you're getting generally?
It depends on the people we're talking to. I mean, if it's a wide array, there's a lot of kind of the question with regards to the state of investor relations across the variety of different investors encountered, from everything from angel through to institutional and different funds, and kind of what you get is a mixed bag. People who understand the reasons why those changes need to occur, and then some who kind of just very quickly write off that it's too complex or too maybe it doesn't have a high enough level of kind of hyper growth that they typically look for in an investment. And that's, you're looking at a pool of investors that many of which have been skewed toward hyper growth technology companies in a lot of areas. So there's work to be done in bridging that gap to showcase where the value is in long-term durable assets.
Got it. Yeah, that's really interesting. So when you're in an investment environment which has historically prolonged low interest rates. So I'm imagining that it's going to take some time and runs on the board that you need to get yourselves. It's probably going to be a 3 to 5 year project at least, because you've got the dividend phase to still get to. Are they some of the noises that you're getting from people too? They're sort of going, "Oh, well, look, we love what you're doing, but we're going to wait and see how you go."
There's a bit of that, and there's a bit of, "We love what you're doing. Call us when you're ready to raise $100 million." And that's
so a capacity thing at your end. Yeah.
So a lot of it is building the pipeline of projects to be able to support larger dollar amounts. Because a lot of when we're talking about trying to scale up to the levels of what the solar industry did, you're looking at a similar level of tier with regards to who we're looking at for investment. And they don't usually play at anything sub 30 million.
Yeah. Well, that's really curious because coming back to our comments about capacity earlier, you've got to have a value chain capacity, which has got to be in place here as well. I mean, if you're going to do even a $10 million project, there's a lot of value chain that's got to be done there.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you're doing the $50,000, $100,000 project, well, that's still niche, isn't it? Very local niche, but when you get into the millions, and then you're getting into the thousands and thousands of trees and so on, it really starts to change the dynamic, doesn't it?
Exactly.
And that's 10 plus years down the line.
Yeah.
And so for us, we're looking at kind of there's a wide array of people who are ready for us to move faster, people who are looking at us for moving slower, and it's really what we're looking at is how can we have a good sustainable growth strategy as an organization that doesn't move us too fast, breaks it, but moves fast enough where it actually makes the impact that we're trying to accomplish at a pace that is alongside that of the change that we wanting to accomplish.
And at the end of the day, we are planting trees, so there's a certain level of patience and allowance of time that goes with that. As these pieces of what would build a larger market and a larger industry start to come together, there's actually the capacity for all those pieces of the system to come to play together rather than all having to happen overnight. Yeah.
I think it's a really good point. And again, to make the distinction between plantation culture and agroforestry culture, it's got a different volume to it anyway because of the integration.
And with the agroforestry culture, one could have the same number of trees spread out over a broader acreage and still have that either livestock or crop component.
Correct. That
doesn't really interfere with tree growth. Whereas with plantations, that's your only product.
Yeah, it's one or the other. Yeah.
You're going to feel a lot more pressure from that. Whereas with alley cropping and silvopasture systems, you get better wood and, say, more weight gain on cattle because of the shade.
Yeah.
So thinking.
Yeah, no, it's a very interesting one. I worked for one of the managed investment schemes here in the 90s. I did GIS work for them because the way that program worked was, which was how most of them worked, they took an investor bought a unit of land, but that at the start, so you bought, say, each unit was, say, a quarter of an acre, and each quarter of an acre had X number of trees in it. And the way it started off was you bought those units, but the units didn't actually have to be positioned on any land. It was just like it was you were part of the fund pool. And then the government changed the rules, which was where I had to be employed, where I came in. So Jeremy, if you bought 30 units in this particular scheme, I needed to allocate you a little piece of that land to do that. And one of the things that I got into talking...
30 boxes, huh?
Yeah, 30 boxes, right? So that might be, 30 times, 10 acres or so, 8 acres, thereabouts. So I needed to find you that 8 acres and allocate it to you of physical landscape. Now, when I looked at this, because I was invited in by an associate and to do this GIS work, and I started to look at the project, and I could see the lack of integration and the lack of value in it socially and environmentally, and so on. And talked to them about doing more agroforestry kind of work. But for them, it seemed to be, and this is again that sort of plantation mindset, you don't want to muddle yourself with the details. You don't want to deal with context. So for them, it was a matter of, here's my checkbook, I'll go around to a farmer, I'll buy the farm for, say, twice as much as its current value and kick them off, and I'll just wall-to-wall trees and so on. It's a very different approach to do agroforestry. And like you said, Harry, I think the great promise is that we can rehabilitate and restore much wider acreages doing this kind of thing than we can with plantation culture. And you've seen a fair bit of that. I know in your blog, you've done some really nice work on some of the stuff that you've seen in South America and elsewhere. Do you want to speak to some of that and some of those positives that you've seen?
Yeah. So what I did was, late at night I end up perusing Google Earth, and I lived in Argentina for a half year back in 2012. So I'm looking down the Pampas, and then there are these dark green river valleys. One is the Rio Negro, there's the Rio Colorado, and some other tributaries they're the snowmelt from the Andes and flow to the ocean. Mm-hmm. And what they've done is dam up that snowmelt into very large lakes. The Rio Negro Dam is that lake is about the size of Lake Champlain for the Yankees, just for some ground truthing. And they flood irrigate the floodplains all the way from the Andes to the ocean through cement canals. And what they have there are very it's a grid of poplar windbreaks. So poplar being cottonwood and aspen, populus genus.
Yep.
In the U.S. we call Liriodendron tulipifera. We call that yellow poplar. So it's a common name mix up. But traditionally they've grown tree fruit there, so apples, and pears, and cherries, in a region that only gets 7 inches of rain per year. So they flood irrigate everything, turning the clouds on and off. And so the fruit markets are changing, but markets change faster than trees grow. So there's that shift going on. And like imports are coming in from Chile and Brazil, disrupting that market. So what a lot of folks are doing are either transitioning to organic, which is a lot easier there because you don't have the fungal pressure because the air is so dry, or within those grids, say 250 by 250 meters of windbreaks, they'll grow alfalfa, or there were some poplar plantations just for wood that we visited. And what they're doing is planting just poplar cones in rows, and then alley cropping cattle feed, or theoretically could be anything, human feed. And then when the trees get too big for the annual crops below, they'll just move the cattle through that system. That was one specific system that we looked at, but there was a lot of other silvopasture and orchards going on there. What's interesting about that integration is that they use the windbreak wood. So the windbreaks protect the apple orchards, and they have to ship the apples out in crates. And the apple crates, the boxes, are made of the wood from made of windbreak wood. So it's this full stack integrated business ecosystem. In that they don't have forests there, so they have to grow the wood they need without compromising food production, or just short-term production, be it fruit or cattle. So it's this very integrated landscape that I had been researching for a while, but going there was pretty useful in grasping the the de facto and historical integration of that system. So that was, yeah.
You also went to the tropics a couple weeks prior to that.
Yeah.
And saw a project Fazenda de Toca as well.
Yeah, that was so Pedro, Marcelo, and Fabio, who are the we'll say the asset managers of Fazenda de Toca, it's the Life in Syntropy video for the viewers. It's this 5,700 acre farm in Sao Paulo, Brazil. So are we still on?
Yeah. I'm just sharing your Facebook page and some of this stuff so viewers can see some of the places that you've been. So this is Fazenda de Toca. Is this one?
Yep. That's
where you're up the tree there.
Yeah.
That's the Eucalyptus grandis.
Yep. So they pollard the eucalypts to mulch the bananas below, and that's a broadacre mechanized system designed by Ernst Getsch, and so the Fazenda de Toca crew was actually that's in the Dominican. Was actually in New York when we were in New York. So we met up with them at the Good Life Farm, or Good Life Farm in Interlochen, New York, which is near Cornell, in the Finger Lakes region. And I was planning on going to Argentina, South America anyway, and then figured it would be useful to stop off in Brazil before that to try and understand what practices transfer between tropical syntropic ag and temperate climate syntro. So that was good.
We had a interview with Orico a few weeks ago, actually a couple of months ago, on syntropic agriculture, and he's working in Australia and also in Brazil as a Brazilian. And we didn't talk about temperate stuff much. Was that something that you saw, just as a sideline here? Was that something that you saw much of? Because the syntropic agriculture certainly started in a wet tropical region, is now going into the seasonal tropics, but I haven't seen much of any work in the temperates.
Yeah, it's a good question. It's so syntro is, it's complex, but I think it boils down to biomass accumulation with non-commercial species, specifically early successional tree species. So in the tropics, the sun is much stronger, so you can have that eucalyptus with the banana right underneath it, but there isn't as much solar energy in higher latitudes. So having an overstory with an understory of apples isn't as realistic. But the concept of bringing those early successional species like poplar, alder, willow in to actually change the soil composition and soil biology is it still makes a lot of sense. So those Salicaceae and alder species and just the early successional species in general associate with both pasture fungi and forest fungi, so endomycorrhizae and ectomycorrhizae, and just bringing in that fungal biomass, be it above ground, mostly above ground in the tropics, or mostly below ground in temperate zones, I think can actually do a lot for just diversifying the soil column in in an apple orchard. So it's just a way to add biodiversity, and I think I've written an article about that as well that we haven't published yet, just because it's long and I'm compressing it and making it more palatable. But actually I've been recently posting the Fazenda de Toca photos to just kind of lead up to posting that article. So that'll come out pretty soon. Yeah, and the other takeaway from that is how much time are we going to spend with in situ biomass? Because in a place where labor is proportionally less expensive to food versus say France or the United States, pollarding a tree at 30 feet high and then using those branches to mulch right next to it, that takes a lot of time. And everyone's context is different, but just thinking about how much time and money it takes to manage these systems is a pretty huge takeaway from that trip.
And it also incorporates a climbing arborist into your yearly activities.
Which is the most dangerous job, I mean.
And of course, it's as a 50-year-old man, climbing trees is. I'm not the monkey I used to be.
Yeah, the less aerial chainsaw work you design into your system, the better.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. We had a really great interview, which I don't know if you saw, with Rowan Reed and Andrew Stewart a few weeks ago. Yeah. And I think one of the biggest takeaways I got from that was right at the end, where Andrew Stewart talked about, I think he had some piece up where he looked at the volume of output of woody biomass from his agroforestry systems versus the total biomass from his animal systems, because he's a sheep grower who grows trees. Only 5% of his landscape, from memory, was allocated to trees, and yet, from memory, I think he was producing something like 200 tons or more per year of forestry products, versus about 60 or 70 tons of animal products. Did you see, or have you seen, and have you estimated in your projects, or in the projects that you've seen and in the projects that you're promoting, any kind of outputs as part of the pitch?
Outputs of biomass, or
both, of all, because a production system has an existing value, to go and layer, as it were, another value out of it, which is, in the sense of trees largely coming out of thin air. Then have you spoken much to that, and have you got many values that you can bring to the table? Because when I listened to that of Andrew, I hadn't heard many people talk in such a way where they're saying, all right, well, I'm getting X from this, I'm getting Y from this. I did ask him, but I said it'd be great to follow this up with a dollar value here, because it's really compelling to people. I mean, farmers are ultimately people who produce food, fiber, and energy crops to meet a market demand. So if there's a profit there to do something, well then that makes it more compelling to allow to happen, and for investors to invest in.
Yeah. So the number that gets cited most frequently that we've heard is that as opposed to monoculture grain and monoculture plantation forestry, when you combine them together, the resulting net income, so the resulting profit, is 140% that of the systems separately. So you get 40% more money from combining the system.
Right.
That number specifically came from wheat and populous timber in southern France. That was part of the safe studies, so silvo-arable agroforestry for Europe, out of France and England, I believe Greece, and an assortment of countries. Similar figures. There's a professor in Missouri named Larry Godsey who does a lot of risk and reward calculation and forecasting for agroforestry in the US. And his figures were at about 160 or 170%. So the closer you get to the tropics, the lower your latitudes, the greater that value is going to be.
Right.
Because the sun's stronger and you can grow more income in the understory.
And it's a variable thing when you're looking at fruit and nut crops, which have a higher net income than most other classifications of crop types per acre, comparatively to timber, and adding that to row crops, you kind of get a diversification of what that can look like on a given piece of property.
Yeah. So I've got a couple of questions that have come through on the Facebook here. This is from, or a point, I think. This is from Dick Simmons. Some regenerative processes are profitable on their own and may not be employed for marketing or brand reasons. So that takes us back to our starting point. Did you want to make a comment to that at all?
I can comment on a little bit. Yeah, that's definitely true. I think in the interesting thing in some of those discussions that we've had so far have been that the systems operate well on themselves. They can be profitable. If there are other components that come with that, like ecosystem services markets, so like the carbon market or like the marketing piece of it, if those become like ancillary value adds to kind of the inherent profitability of an agroforestry system, I think we feel like it makes sense to bring in those like ancillary value adds rather than kind of box them away. And like you said earlier, Darren, agroforestry is about integration, and so we kind of think about that through what happens on the markets side as well.
And the kind of on that thinking, I think there's ways in which on the market side, there's ways in which they can provide more certainty before you put the systems in place, whether that be through pre-purchase agreements or it be through kind of just commitments to the marketing story and engaging in their supply chain, putting trees on their supply chain farms. That there's a lot of ways in which that working with the market provides value, both financial but also social value. And engaging that story there is going to provide the most amount of accessibility to growing this thing. And I don't think we kid ourselves. We don't think that necessarily every brand out there is ready for it. Every market out there is ready for it. But those that are definitely kind of dipping their feet in a little bit now. which makes it interesting. And builds a little bit more certainty that there will be a buyer in place at the end when everything starts to give fruit.
We oftentimes end up in these like chicken and egg situations. So the money needs to come first in order for the systems to be put in the ground, and the systems can't be put in the ground unless we know there's money coming in through a buyer. So from that angle, and if everyone's kind of moving through and upgrading their capacity a little bit across these different groups, in different industries, whether financiers or brands or equipment vendors, etc., like the list goes on, everyone kind of upgrading together, in theory, should move the needle in a positive direction.
And I think one of the things to say there is I think everyone wants a piece of the premium, which is if you can make certain claims about a system, there's a question of there might be consumers who are willing to pay a premium for those claims. We're very cautious with that because it can very easily be co-opted. But it definitely is something that on the brand side they're looking at with regards to they have to pay premiums across the supply chain. And you're looking at whether it's growing grain that is incorporating better practices. Oftentimes the infrastructure is not in place where they have to pay larger quantities to get higher quality grains, product sets. So the brands are interested in trying to figure this out as well, but the costs right now for them is also very high to be able to do it. So there's a lot of room for helping them figure it out as well.
So from Kevin Muno, who you may well know, Kevin's he's looking at doing some other investment type work. I would say he's got a bit of a different model, but Kevin asks, how's the Mediterranean strategy developing? Curious as to growth strategies in other climates. And then he says, I love the model and love the website, guys. Good on you. And how many projects in the ground so far? So to start with that, what's the Mediterranean other climate sort of strategy? Or the sticking with the temperates at this stage, or how are you playing there?
Yeah, so right now our focus is primarily in the Northeast, Midwest, and Southeast regions of the U.S. A few reasons for why that is. One is we're all kind of co-located in those areas.
Yep.
We've done a lot more time and energy into looking at those systems and modeling those systems. The other reasons why is because it's a little bit easier in areas where there is not issues with water for us to be able to have a little bit more certainty around the consistency of through the course of the year that there will be water supplies on a given property. So the risk's a little bit lower in some regard. And then I think with regards to the Mediterranean climate strategy, we're really tentative about moving too fast. Eventually, I think we may end up getting there, but most likely through partners in those regions, wherever we might go. At this point, we're not at a stage yet where we can commit to doing Mediterranean climate zones. Though we're if there's the right partner in the right place at the right time, there's openness to help on a variety of the elements that go into implementing a really good strategy. From doing the work on modeling crops through to structuring the investment side. We're open to it. In terms of projects, just in terms of getting you guys caught up as to where we're at, last year we completed kind of our first version of our taproot model, which is where we're facilitating the sale of a system to a landowner over the course of a payment in installments period. It's kind of very similar to design and install, but it's a little bit more structured and can have kind of some debt structures that are built on top of it for landowners that want to take a longer time period to pay off the asset. And then this year we're scaling that up on a farm in the Northeast, just about 200 acres of planting, about 30,000 trees. And then on the evergreen model, where we actually take on the asset management just through the distribution of the crops, that this year is starting our first pilot on about 26 acres in the Hudson area. Though we have a lot of projects that are kind of in the development pipeline across the Midwest and Southeast regions that are at different stages of development for kind of some of our audit work. So trying to kind of ramp them up to be ready for actually being able to put capital in those places.
Mm-hmm.
And then right now we're in kind of a state where we're a little bit inundated with land opportunities. People like the idea of being able to have trees on their land and as a productive asset. So we're kind of in the process of building out an initial portfolio in given regions, so we can actually make those viable.
So yeah. Well, I suppose. Sorry, I'll let you speak first, Ethan.
No, please go ahead.
I was just going to say, it seems like, which is probably reasonable. You've probably got more landholder demand than you've got investor flow.
Exactly.
Was that pretty? Which one would think would only be natural.
There are more folks that want managed tree crops on their property than there are investors willing to back the initial capital outlays to install those tree crops. But that's changing quickly.
Yeah, I think it's definitely changing rapidly. And when we had first started out and we're looking at what will it take to build a profitable agroforestry industry, one of the things that we were looking at is there's likely a lot of education needed on the investor front to keep kind of up to date with the happenings in agroforestry, the happenings in regenerative agriculture, going back to what do those words actually mean and what do those systems look like and how do they operate, what's the context. What we've really started to see, and this seems to be like really spinning up as of this year, is the appetite and education level of the investment world has moved at a rapidly quicker pace than we had originally anticipated, which is positive news. I think the way our economy works is if we can get some financial capital flowing, that might play as a pretty serious trim tab to the larger kind of industry at hand. So that's happening, and that helps me sleep at night, at least.
And I think a big part of it is getting the projects ready. And there's kind of the idea is really sound, but get the projects to be ready to actually put trees in the ground and manage those trees take a little bit of an effort. And being able to pool them to have a large enough project base in a region, such that we can go out and raise a larger fund specifically for those projects. Oftentimes, if you're looking at projects in the range of anywhere from $250,000 projects up to $1 million projects, a lot of investors are not as interested comparatively to the 30 million or more project base. So it's really kind of building out that pipeline to be able to support a larger dollar amount.
Which is it's an interesting predicament, because as you grow, losing touch with the specific contexts of each land manager becomes a challenge. But I guess we can't let that impede us too much.
No, well, it's just one of the rules of the game, as it were. It's the terrain in which you're playing. I've just got a point here from David Mattison, which I think is a good one and plays into this. Have you pitched the concept to farmer co-ops that have a pool of regional farms? We have a dairy co-op here that's pushing for more organic product, where there is a potential for internal best practice developments.
Yeah, so that I think is one of the biggest opportunities for us, because if we can start working with an entity that consists of smaller entities that all work together and trust each other, and interact, then that lets us move more quickly with a group of people that have similar contexts. And I could go. Yeah.
I was going to say, and here in the States, a lot of that comes down to some farmer co-ops, as well as larger companies like a Maple Hill Creamery, for example, here in New York State, which has a large network of grass-fed beef. Grass-fed dairy farms in New York State. So there's a ways in which we look at it both from a corporate engagement side as well as a pharma cooperative side as well.
Yeah, it's an interesting. Oh, go on, Ethan.
Yeah. So we have 2 research fellows this summer, MBA students, that are looking at how that might work in the Lake Champlain watershed. So looking at where the opportunities are to partner with larger dairy supply chains on either side of Lake Champlain in Vermont and New York. And then seeing if state funds for the cleanup of Lake Champlain can actually go towards funding agroforestry systems to start out in riparian zones. So that's a huge opportunity for us.
Yeah, it is, and we already know that that there's a number of people who have got good investment from various government programs. One of the things that struck me on that point about co-ops from David was in Europe, particularly in Spain, where I've worked a lot, the farmer unions, as they're called, which are on a regional basis. They're in effect they're co-ops, and they function as kind of like food hubs do in places which where you've got, a space where you can come in. Say an area is. I'm thinking of one place I went to in Mallorca at Porreras, and the farmer union there had a commercial kitchen, provided space for all of that kind of work that a lot of people do in food hubs with multiple products, not just one. As opposed to a dairy co-op where it's just dairy. These function to assist farmers with the processing infrastructure for multiple different crops. Do you see that? I mean, I know that in the US you've got that farmer hub. It's probably in the US. It's probably stronger than anywhere else. That whole farm hub thing as being something to look into or to tap into. And second to that is, have you looked at providing investor funds for those food hubs or those farm hubs? Because they're not food hubs necessarily when you're talking agroforestry, because you've got timber products as well as non-timber products.
Yeah, so there's a few things there. I mean, there's a behemoth in the U.S., Organic Valley, which is a really big food hub out in Wisconsin. That is a good example of that. And then there's farm hubs like the Savory Institute all over the world, which and agroforestry.
Well, that's more of an educational farmer hub as opposed to a physical farm hub of the type that we're talking about.
Right. I think the tricky part for us at this point is those types of opportunities are arising. There's farm hubs. A really awesome organization down in Georgia called Georgia Organics is a good example of a farm hub as well. It's really, I think the tricky part for us at this point is kind of the chicken and the egg scenario of making sure that when we're moving through these conversations and stewarding them forward with all the different hubs that might develop, doing so in accordance with kind of the rate of capital and with really good expectations that things are going to move a little bit slow at first. We can't get everyone's hopes up that investment capital is going to start pouring into a region before we actually solidify a lot of that infrastructure in place in that region. And that's kind of a lot of the work that we're working on is kind of how can we build the infrastructure such that it can be modular for hubs in different regions. And for both corporates, nonprofits, et cetera, co-ops, things like that.
Harry, Ethan, did you have anything to add to that?
No, these guys did a pretty good job answering that one. I'll leave the best words to these two.
Point I made here in my notes while listening, the whole collaborative economy, and that sort of flows on from Kevin's comment. I think within the Regrarians network, which you guys are a part of, and our team, and people like Kevin, who's also part of our team, and others on the periphery of that, there seems to be a time now where we're shifting into a much more collaborative model, isn't there? I mean, companies have always, I don't know, it's what's the difference between collusion and collaboration?
I mean, I was going to say, I think Ethan, I know you want to add a point on this, but I think for us, it comes down to a very simple idea of adding value in every place you possibly can, and not trying to extract value. I mean, I think creating value for others in every area is a difficult task to do. And I think a lot of the operations that we're shifting toward are how can we provide that value without necessarily having it to be something that benefits us in the short term. And that's a shift that we're seeing for sure.
Yeah, I mean, it's part of the climate of the mind conversation. And collusion, collaboration, is there a difference? Maybe that comes down to consciousness. But then how do you quantify that? So it all gets kind of sticky and odd. But at the end of the day, it's, do we actually provide value and care for each other the same way we care for the living capital of the world?
Well, the way I would look at the difference between collusion and collaboration is that collusion has a very self-centered set of outcomes, whereas collaboration, you're looking at the whole and typically trying to get a much broader set of outcomes than you would otherwise if you were just thinking, you get a couple of businesses together and they're trying to, they're looking after number one, which is of course important. But one of the things in this whole space is that we're generally trying to be a lot more holistic about it.
And one of the tenets of how we work is to proactively avoid scarcity mindsets, in that a rising tide lifts all ships. Teamwork makes the dream work. And if someone else wants to do something very similar to what we're doing, we encourage that, because that's going to grow the industry, that's going to grow the movement, and bring everyone up. So
yeah, I also think it's really hard to it's really hard when everyone has their own context and their own need to live, right? And they have their own support systems that they're trying to develop. And trying to kind of build the capacity to be present with people in their process of development and their process of what their needs are is kind of a core tenet to what we're trying to accomplish. I think that being said, there's limitations to us as humans. I mean, there's only so many emails that one can respond to in a day. So there's a difficulty in our ability to manage expectations as well, such that we don't leave people in bad places, and with bad taste in their mouth. And that's also a fragile part of the process.
On the last webinar, Daniela said, you may be all at a ball dancing to the same music and you're all having a good time, but you don't need to dance with everyone. No. Just find the people you want to dance with and all have a good time together. Yeah,
that's Danielle is a very wise person, and they were very wise words to hear from her. I've got a question here that I wrote as well. In all of this, plug your guest. It's hard to read their name, please. Sorry, this is from Dick Simmons. I think you're referring to Propagate Ventures. I don't know, Dick, maybe you want to elaborate on your point there, mate. I'm sorry I didn't put your. I've had them. I've had your stuff on the page for some time, so it says Propagate Ventures there. Yeah, pretty.
You're getting to the old photos now.
Yeah. There we go. Well, there's some great photos. Well, I think this is really important. Just before I get to my point that I was going to make, I think it's really important that you've actually gone around and done the research, because one of the things that we've promoted our clients to do over the many years is to go and self-educate for a while before you ultimately go and get started. I can think of one particular client who, before he started his whole farm up, his new farm enterprise, he took a trip over to the UK because he had a particular type of setup that he wanted to do, and it was in the UK that gave him that evidence. So he went and did the interviews and spent the time and so on, and then when he came back here, adapted that model and has been really, really successful as a result. I think you think it has been really valuable to go and do that before I get to my next question?
I was going to say, I mean, it's been the highest value add to what just our education of what the ecosystem needs.
Yeah.
You know, like you can sit in your apartment or your house and try to concoct new inventions, but at the end of the day, it's not until you go out and talk to people about it and get their feedback that you're going to know whether or not it's actually a need. I think for the first year, I mean, every year we do about a month trip that we planned, which is a road trip in different regions across the U.S. Mm-hmm. So 2 years ago, we did the Midwest. Last year, we did the Northeast and Southern Quebec. And then this upcoming year, I think we're actually looking at doing the Southeast regions here in the U.S. as well. And Harry's taken, unfortunately, I didn't get to join him down in Brazil and Argentina, but you kind of, those learnings have been really key for as much to know what to do, as much to know what not to do.
Yeah. So point I was going to make about you guys generally, in this model, we started off this conversation talking about people being looked after a bit too well, and that greed has crept in because you are dealing with other people's money. In your business model, do you feel like, or have you built this such that you get looked after? Because I think that's going to be a question that people have in terms of, because this is only as sustainable as you guys being the glue in all of this, I suppose. I mean, you guys are the ones who come in and pull it all together, make the connection. But for you to continue to do that and to continue to facilitate the ongoing nature of the relationships, you still have to have a model which has got enough for 3 young men with their lives ahead of them.
Hopefully more than just 3 as we start to grow.
Yeah.
I think yes, part of the model is in any like fund-like structure or investment-like structure, the managing organization gets a percentage of the return. I think the way in which we've modeled this is performance-based.
Yes.
So we're everything is kind of based off of hitting our hurdles of return on given projects, and we see incentives as an organization based on our performance, with a little bit of kind of with enough to cover the OPEX of the organization just to be able to manage the projects on the ground. So it's a fully transparent budget to investors to showcase what we need. So that way there's no kind of hiding behind our kind of maybe an inflated budget of what we need as an organization.
And how's that been received?
Really refreshing for a lot of people. One of the things that I think we've found most with investors who we talk to is that they want to feel like they're a part of the organization. They don't want to feel like they're just a buyer. Even though at the end of the day, they might be on paper something that looks like kind of a buyer that sits back and relaxes. on the ground level, they're really interested in being a part of the process. And that's a differentiator. I think there's a lot of investments that they never really get to actually touch what they put their money to.
And the outcomes are really important, and we're consistently focused on the outcomes. As it gets into the investment conversations, and similar to exactly what Jeremy's saying here, is that the story of those outcomes is really powerful. We're talking about the capacity for some pretty big, large-scale change, all in a positive direction. So with that in mind, it's one of the exciting things for those outcomes is that getting that to scale in a way that is not extractive does also go back to incorporating a lot of the different pieces together and working with these different groups across the industries, similar to like agroforestry as integration, business as an integration unit, sort of. And that kind of capacity goes back to keeping our organization, our business, and the folks that we work with, whether they be team members or clients or investors or business partners in any realm, getting to the level with all those things that are operating together is pretty powerful.
The investors don't want us to starve. It's like they want us to be able to operate at our highest capacity. Yeah. I think it's
Oftentimes with investment structures, there's a kind of a blurring of the line between what the organization's doing and where the capital is going. We're kind of core to our principle is transparency in that process. And investors happen to like that. They like to be kind of informed, in a way that's kind of systematic and a little bit more with them in mind. But they definitely like to have more information than less.
Yeah.
They just like it to be well designed.
Do you think, I'll just get Garrison Creamer has made a point here. I think individualism and community are support for each other, not a contrasting confliction. Yeah, well, that's very much in keeping with what we talked about before. Here in Australia, and I don't know the laws, the corporate laws in the United States, but some of the biggest investment companies in Australia are non-profits. So most of our retirement funds are not-for-profit, and some of our bigger mutual funds are ostensibly non-for-profits as well. Do you see a space for that in this field?
If you look at like the capital stack, meaning like if you look at if a pipeline of projects is funded 100%. What did that look like in actuality? Right? What percentage of that comes from foundations or nonprofits? What percentage of that comes from private investors or other funds? Right now, I think one of the ripest areas for financing this work is coming from foundations. So it's a big part of our strategy to engage them, at least in the short term, to bridge some of that. A lot of people who are looking at kind of the investment side from a traditional perspective really like to see that movement coming from foundations and nonprofits first.
Okay.
They're co-beneficial, and how do we as an organization allow for that to come together? So we're structured as a public benefit corporation. Means as a business in our charter, we can focus on things that allow us to upgrade social and environmental outcomes. So
Ethan, are you a B Corp then? Is that what you would call, or is it a different thing again?
We're legally what would be considered a B Corp. The certification is not something we have yet. It's something that we'll I'm sure we'll participate in. B Corps have got a lot of really amazing stuff going on. So for us, it's getting that all together in a way that drives value past the financial bits, which is really important. That's kind of one of the core drivers of business, right? But I've heard once, it's like, well, what's the business motive for sustainability? And I forget where I read this, but someone had replied to that on a panel saying, well, what's the business incentive for destroying the planet?
Yeah.
And so as a business, and everything you do has to incorporate that style of thinking, and allow us to make decisions that are ecologically sound, that are also, secure the economics in a positive light.
Yeah. No, I was where I was angling, I suppose, was and you've got me there, was what sort of structure do you guys have, and then again, what's the response been from the from people out there? I mean, I think one of the great things here is, and you're all quite young people, and I think it'd be, if you're an investor, they would look at you three and say, well, look, you're all in your 20s, early 30s. Why would I want to invest in a crew of young people or younger people? But there's certainly, from my perspective, there's a bit of maturity in the way that you've set things up, and the intent by which you've set things up, I think, is really, really positive, and for me would be reassuring as an investor. Have you seen because investing is as much about a vibe as anything else, isn't it? I mean, people have metrics that they will determine whether an investment is worth going with, but there's also a human element to it. There's a lot of trust, isn't there?
Yeah. Well, there's a few things there I think you're touching on, which is there's definitely this question of age bias, which is being that we're young. We have to work doubly as hard in a lot of cases to showcase efficacy, and that's, I think, for good reason, right? Well,
you're up for it,
right? But we're up for it, exactly, right? And then the one thing we've been blessed with is we're being able to work with people who are older, sometimes double our age, like yourself, Darren, to be able to learn from a lot of the work that you've done in setting, and being able to set our generation up for success through this work. And I think the other thing that is reassuring to investors when they think about our age and what we're trying to accomplish is we're looking at 15, 20, 30-year timelines, right? And looking at us at in 20s, early 30s, and projecting it out to the full kind of lifespan of the asset class. They see, okay, these guys are in it for the long haul because they're young, right? They're not going to be retiring in 10 years.
If we were 60 talking about a 20-year investment, the question might be, are you going to be around?
Right.
So,
well, the same question goes with the investor, because in a lot of cases, the investors themselves are going to be of that age class.
Yep.
And that's been one of the resistances that's been part of the resistance to tree-based investments, because most people who have investor funds are of a particular age class, and so you're caught at the wrong end of the age dynamic.
Right. Yeah, totally, and that's part of the change that we're looking at. As that wealth is transferred to younger and younger generations, we're looking at trying to smooth out that investment such that it moves toward things that are important in the world, similar to what we're trying to accomplish and what you're working on. And I think it's a particularly potent conversation now that we're experiencing in more and more conversations, as the question of what happens to that wealth transfer as things start to move toward younger generations.
There's components there that look at the longevity of who's involved in a project. I mean, when we're evaluating where we go next as a business, one of the key questions we ask ourselves is, in making this decision, does it create value for the next 7 generations? And that's a pretty big question. But how do we go down and structure that to the degree that even the next generation can be engaged in what we're focused on, knowing that most of the trees that we'll be putting in the ground will certainly outlive us, which is great. So if we look at something like, how do we get someone from the next generation involved in our business? Well, what's keeping someone who's 12 or younger to be on our board, for example? So getting creative with how we structure and approach situations allows us to ensure the longevity in terms of also the transfer of knowledge to manage and to make agroforestry of cool for the rest of time.
Well, to make it the norm.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And that's really what we're looking at. We're looking at in 20 years from now, are we going to have a burgeoning class of tree owners that are well-trained agroforesters? And that's kind of the division we'd love to see.
Well, I don't see in the next 20 years we're going to get any radical. I mean, we're going to have a bit of a change. I think we're already seeing that. There's certainly there are certainly people of your age class who are shifting back into agriculture as a career, and let's hope to not just being involved in agriculture, but also being involved in agroforestry. But I don't see that we're going to see a complete trend where we're going to have less people living in cities. So when it comes to investment and getting people to become investors at an earlier stage in their life, I would have thought that something like this kind of project would be something that, if you did have that $1, $2, $5, $10,000 that you had as a 25-year-old, that this could be a little bit of a thing that you could, well, not just a little bit, but it could be something because that's going to be a fairly big proportion of what you've got to invest in, that it could be something that could work for you well over time.
Yeah. I want just a note on this is a really good point. I think originally, actually, as an organization, when we 2 years ago, when we originally set out to do our research, we were specifically targeting that price point for investment, and we ran into kind of the tricky part with some of the legal issues around retail investment for people who aren't accredited investors. And that's some of the challenge, with the transaction costs of setting up the ability for those types of investors to invest is very high.
Right.
And it looks very much like a security,
yes,
like investing in stocks, and eventually I think we can get there, but it takes a really strong base to be able to support just the everyday kind of millennial to be able to put aside their $5,000 in tree assets.
Especially when it's going to be as locally as you are trying to have it too. So that, like, here I am, I live in a part of rural America. I've got a job as a teacher or something like that, where I've got a bit of liquidity and I've got a bit of saving, and I want to invest in a local farm that Propagate's working with. Right now, that's kind of difficult unless I've got a bulk of funds.
The way in which that's going to happen right now, the way around that is through pension funds and 401ks.
Yeah.
And those organizations being able to invest because they have this kind of pooled capital that is being moved into these projects.
Yeah.
Eventually, we'd love to see those 401ks provide selection, right? So a local school teacher can tell the 401k manager, "Hey, I want to invest my money over here. Can you do that for me?" But in a lot of cases, we're not quite there yet.
Yeah. Okay.
Just a little tidbit to throw in here. So I think about maybe over a year ago, we were just meeting up with the Terra Genesis crew, and kind of getting to know each other. And something that they said was what Propagate is looking at is, or one of the things that we provided is land access and equity of sorts to people that might not have the ability to buy land. And while they might not be able to buy land, they can own an asset, a biological asset on land that they don't own. And if someone wants to start a tree crop system on a farm without buying the land, even though we might not see that mass exodus from cities, ideally, this is a way to give to provide a path for young people to create a regen ag based livelihood. outside of the metropolises that we're also concentrated in.
Well, when you say that, I think immediately, and we've obviously talked about this before, I think immediately about people not necessarily having that agriculture is that you have the capacity to be a direct investor in agricultural development with the worldview that you particularly have. So you can, it's sort of like I can have my cake and eat it too, sort of thing. I can have the benefits that come with living the lifestyle that you want to live, and are probably very happily living in the city. At the same time as having a closer connection with your food supply, and and helping as a generation to redirect the way agriculture is operated, because it's clearly not operating in the way that most people would like to see it.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note that the cities play a huge role in providing certainty of market, right?
Of course.
Not to undervalue that that's an asset, not necessarily just a liability.
No.
Even though we look at things like carbon footprints of cities and may gasp. On the other side of that as well, there's also a burgeoning interest of people from cities who are interested in engaging in natural landscapes, trying to find ways to reconnect. We have a few projects in our pipeline that are specifically kind of geared around that type of concept. And I think there's a big opportunity for re-engaging people in the learned skills and observation of being out in nature, beyond the scope of a central park in New York City. And that's something that I think is going for our generation that's really potent.
It has to happen.
I see it every day. I know we talk about, most of the people we talk to, albeit we might be in an echo chamber, are interested in engaging with the rural landscape.
Well, that's okay if the echo chamber just gets bigger, ultimately that's where you're going to start, and it's probably where you're going to stay, and that's what you're going to keep to foster. There'll always be people on the periphery who are not inside, and join. They want to. People want to join your club. Well, you join a club for a reason. You become being an investor is something that is akin to that, and you're looking at a very participatory investment system here, aren't you?
Yep, exactly.
Well, as participatory as you want it to be.
Yeah, I think even with some of our peers who are looking at just the food that they're consuming are being driven directly back to more of the rural landscape and outside of where many of them live, which is in the cities. It's like, well, I'll have friends call and ask, where do I get grass-fed beef? It's like, well, where are you? Well, I'm in Colorado. I'm like, well, that should be a lot more easy. Why are you calling me? I'm in New York. But the point is that I think a lot of the demand is there, and there's almost a lack of capacity for folks to get the content, get the information, or have the access that is actually already directly in front of them. Mm-hmm. So part of what we see and like how do we fit into that puzzle is we're almost just helping organize certain aspects of getting engaged in a more systemic approach to agriculture, and so it's let's get to the point where we can easily access that information and easily engage with it. Should make it a heck of a lot easier to like for our peers, get the food that they want to consume.
Yeah, it's a good segue to what you're sharing with people with your screen share, which is
not intentional,
which is our kind of our educational hub site, propagate.org, which is more focused on building the ecosystem, and providing examples and teachings to what's working and what's not, and what's happening in the world around us.
Yeah, it's a very, very well put together site. Tell me, can you see the future already, or is it still is the future still out there?
We have to get our crystal ball to answer that question.
Of course. And you look like the crystal ball kind of guy, Ethan. But
the future's bright. At least, I mean, the summer's looking really good now that winter in the Northeast is slowly coming to a close. We've had a really cool spring. But this summer looks like more conferences, talking to investors. We have that 26-acre plot in Hudson, New York, where we're doing a lot of soil prep this year for mainly apples and shrub fruit, some riparian, elderberry, pawpaw, poplar systems, and then some chestnuts too. But that looks great. And then just I'll be doing a lot of background research, and the next months look like shrub fruit and diving deeper into apples. So yeah, life is good.
It's a question of how fast things are going to move, right? The pace at which each part of the company's conversation is moving is relative to how fast they are ready for it. So I think one of the things that we're seeing is that the farms and landscape managers are the most ready for it. The investors, brands are ready to talk about it. And we're kind of doing that groundwork to bring investors ready to put the money in the ground.
Well, is there anybody else in this space that you're aware of?
Not with the model that we're proposing. There are traditional, more traditional investment frameworks around permanent crops, which you mentioned, more traditional frameworks around timber, but no one that's specifically focused on the integration with existing operations. And so it's a little bit of a white space in that regard.
No one in temperate climates. There's a firm out of Quebec, I think they're called Ecotierra, they're working with coffee and cacao cooperatives. So that's an agroforestry-based fund. And then in the U.S., there are folks like Iroquois Valley Farms and Farmland LP that they're not focused on tree-based systems per se, but what they do is acquire conventional farmland and convert it to organic and provide returns that way. So
there's one in Oregon that I came across when I was working with Andrew Millison up there. They've got a very, very targeted investment in the Willamette Valley, or Willamette, I should say, not the Willamette. Willamette, damn it, as they say. Although don't damn it. But a very, very targeted and strategic investment in mostly organic annual crop production, but not this kind of thing.
I think there's the thing that we're seeing around every corner is just an abundance of opportunity. It's just a matter of making sure we move tactfully and measurably through that process.
Well, I think Garrison made a very good point there on the Facebook that trust is built in drops and lost in buckets.
Great. Love that.
Yeah, so do I. I think it's a ripper. So thanks for that, Garrison. So what are the next steps? When I ask about the future, it's obviously a fairly incremental future because that's a careful future, and that is that trust built in drops. But still, do you see yourself in 5 years' time, or what do you see in 5 years' time? Where do you think that will be? Because a lot of the investments that you all have put in the ground now will be seeing fruit then, and that'll put on a different phase to things.
Yeah, I think we think that in 5 years from now, investors will be ready to put money in at a large scale, I'm talking from $50 million to the $100 million scale. The goal between now and then is to prove out that there can be security in the asset class. And that's the biggest challenge. But we think with all the things that we've seen on the ground level, working with farmers and landowners to try to build out the right system in place and the right incentive structures, that it's in 5 years going to be ready for that.
There's movement, I think, across, like if we can put the world of regenerative agriculture into a sort of box and say there's an entire industry being built around it that feels like it's happening. So like the investor landscape is moving, and we think it's going to move through retail investment and up to the institutional level, which would be great. Those are definitely huge components. I mean, for example, when the solar industry got to the level where it was able to take on institutional capital, that's really changed the game. And now we're looking at really scaling out the solar industry to a landscape level, which is great. And there's components that are continuing to take place, like Jeremy and Harry have said, that like the brands are ready to talk about it. The folks on the ground are ready to do the work. The money's starting to move. The folks that might be more on the manufacturing or processing side are looking at more distributed systems and what that looks like. So there's a lot of stuff happening, and I think the movement's quick. So as much as we're kind of able to hold that movement to something that has context and
yeah, I think just building off of that, I think it's bringing, as the amount of capital that's going to be wanting to move into this arena is going to be large, and bringing together the cohorts of people that can all share in that process and provide expertise across every stage of development is key. And that's for us where we're not kidding ourselves that we're three young guys with a certain level of experience that you can get within your 30 years of life. But we lean and will continue to lean on bringing in people like yourself, Darren, and others in the regions that we're looking at to build the capacity to do this work in those places. So sharing the love is a big part of it.
Yeah. Yes. Well, I suppose the point that I'd probably go to now is, do you see yourselves in your job positions in the way that you've organised yourselves? Do you see yourselves being nourished in each one of those as it stands now?
Oh man, that is the right question. I think one of the things that has been really beneficial about these two guys over here is we've kind of all kind of been able to support each other in developing ourselves in the role that we think is we want for ourselves. And I think I know for me, I've been part of multiple organizations for the past 10 years of my life. Some startups that have and some larger organizations, and I don't think I felt more supported than what these two have provided. So super grateful for them.
Well, being in California, you could almost hug at this moment.
Yeah,
Well, you can.
We complement each other really well. We're in the same organization, but we all have different contexts and different desires in terms of what we want to be doing day to day, and I think that's good. It's there's strength in that diversity, but we share this direction and solidarity with each other, and that makes the wheels turn around. So
there's a pretty strong guiding principle that we all want to plant trees too. It's pretty, that's a good bond.
I think at the end of the day, we feel like our business is pretty fluid. And so with that, our roles within the business can remain fluid, which means what we're doing today, what we sit in, and kind of what fills our day of tasks, if you will, those things can change and will likely change over time as more people are part of our team and our family. And one thing I think for the three of us is we're all open to that. We're all comfortable with being strategic and playing the role in the context that's needed in that moment in time, and then in the present, in the future, and how that might be different from the past. And with that in mind is, will I always be doing the exact same thing I'm doing today? Probably not. But am I doing something that's constantly adding value to what the direction in which the organization is moving? Is probably more of a way that I think over time we'll continue to evaluate how we are part of that team that makes the business drive.
Yeah, just to add on his point there, it's like I think there's always somebody who's better suited to make a decision, given what's presented, right? I would trust Harry far more so than myself to make a decision on where to put the key line, the guideline. So there's I think one of the things that we have going for us is also that we know where each other's gaps are. And that's, I think, as important as knowing kind of what each other's skills are, and being able to hold each other in where those gaps are and be okay with the fact that there's gaps alone is a big thing that's been supportive.
I was expecting the two of them to say they defer all decisions to me, but I guess that wasn't going to happen.
You're still consolidating on your keyline guideline work, Ethan.
Day by day.
Well, I think it's what's interesting to me in this culturally is that, and it happens, I think, with every generation. My I think I'm Generation X. You guys might be classified as millennials, to put a label on it.
Such a dirty word.
Yeah, and then we've got my parents who are the baby boomers, etc. With every generation, there's also always a looking down on that last one, saying, all right, well, and a sort of a categorization of them. Usually with some sort of negative. And there's certainly been that of millennials, as there has been up the line. The entitled baby boomers who had a great inheritance post-war and are one of the wealthiest generations to have ever existed. There's your generation who are looked down along on a whole lot of lines, but one of the things that I'm very positive, having children who are not quite your age, because I'm only 1.6 times older than you guys. Not
you did the math. That's good.
we're 26 and 27.
Yeah, well, good on you. Now you're all conferring with each other. The point I was going to make is that one of the things that I've observed about people of the generation that you're a part of is collaboration and communication, honest communication between each other seems to be much more implicit. People seem to be a lot more upfront about how they are with each other, I would say. And so from an operational perspective, when you've got a group of people working together, I think that that's a real positive, because there is that. I mean, it's a very strange era because, I know with my younger children who, whatever part of, 16 and 18, they don't know anything but the social media era. And so it's almost overt, extroverted extroversion and openness. Everyone knows exactly what everyone's feeling at any given time. And so I think that feeds into this. And that would give me that you guys are getting into that period where you can build that into a business, I think is a real positive.
Yeah, definitely. Like anything in life, it has its challenges, but you just work the edges and you get to the final result. You get to the outcome. But I agree. I mean, I think a lot of the negativity around our age group in particular, it actually has nothing to do with generations, but more so to do with it's more of an age-specific problem. There's very few people I know who in their 20s didn't want to be promoted and be successful. And I mean, I think everyone has that. And my parents wanted that. My grandparents wanted it. So it's not a generational thing. And then all the other stuff that I think our generation, given maybe sparked by the technology we grew up with, like you're saying, Aaron, as that moves to younger folks, it's the capacity to get to a level that we're clear and transparent and concise with each other happens at a much faster rate. So like, I know if I have a conversation with my younger siblings or my like young cousins, they'll ask questions. And if I say something and they think it's stupid, they'll just say that's stupid, rather than dancing around the details of politics. And that's great. And maybe the world needs more of that.
Yeah. Yeah. That's where I was getting to, I think. Yeah.
And I think there's a little bit of like a lack of understanding because of the fact that we were really one of the first generations to grow up with like that as our underbelly with technology. The rate of learning with our generation is really high as a result, I think.
Well, the rate of access.
And access, right.
Yeah. Yeah, because there's an omniscience to the whole. Well, knowledge is one thing, but information is another. But there's a complete access to information now. Yeah. So if I want to check out you, I can check you out straight away just by going on and checking you out. You know, it's pretty easy.
I think that resulted in a kind of a miscommunication between generations, where the way where we're coming from as a group of young people is very different than where the boomer generation, for example, is coming from in how they do things, not necessarily in what it is they want done.
The organization, or the way that I see a lot of the organizing happening from a cultural perspective, has a lot to do with probably the access that access that you're talking about is. We're not organizing around ideology because there's access to all the ideologies. We all know how to use search engines and we all know how to use computers. So getting to that is much easier. So the organization of the culture around how things work comes more about what actions are people taking.
I think we're almost in an era of post ideology because. I mean, that was what the 20th century was about, thrashing all of that out, and we've got that out of the way and hopefully learned our lessons from it. And that's why, I look at what I've got on the page right now. Stewardship drives everything. I think if any ideology is worth following, then it's stewardship. And that's one thing that I see a lot of this generation saying. And it's kind of like, if you look at the boomers in the 60s, they had stewardship on mind. They had people and planet on their mind, but they didn't have profit on their mind because profit was ideologically unsound for a lot of those folks. Whereas now we're sort of coming where, you know, people of your age in this era are quite happy to pull all of that together. And I think that's really profound and going to take us places. So well done. And we love what you're doing, and we love to be at least a bit of a fly on the wall and be a support to what you're doing. And I think people will have got a lot from today. Did you have anything else you wanted to add before we close up?
Just likewise, Darren. Thanks for being there. Thanks for helping us out along the journey. It's been good.
I mean, on that point, it's like, Darren, there are not many communities like the ones that you've curated, and one that kind of shares a set of principles that is aligned and global. And so that is really special, and deep appreciation for you for pulling that together and for helping us through this process.
And for everyone involved.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's not just myself at Naturally. Well, bravo to you, and where people just find out more by going onto your Facebook, which is Propagate Ventures, and also to your onto your website. So you've got the two websites, Propagate Ventures and propagate.org. That's Propagate, not Propagate. Just make sure you get that right. And
Our biggest marketing challenge.
Yeah.
We're on Instagram as well, and if you want to reach out in any of those places, don't hesitate to do so.
You're everywhere. Yes, omnipresent. Well, let's hope that that Propagate shifts from being Propagate to Regenerate, and that what you guys are leading is going to be the new normal. So bravo to you, and here's to more of it. And thank you very much for being our guest today.
Of course.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
No worries at all. All right. Well, for those of you who have just caught in, we'll be this has all been recorded and will be shared through the Regrarians website, and probably through the Propagate websites as well, and our various social media. So thank you again to Jeremy, Harry and Ethan for joining us today from Propagate Ventures, and we look forward to catching up with everyone next week. Thank you very much.
Cheers.
Adios.
Hasta luego.
Hasta la próxima.